I welcome you to the Episcopal Church of the Redeemer on Tech Drive in Ruston, Louisiana in the United States. And so this is session 2 of the Revelation to John. I show you the book that we are using, and this was the first one in the series of the Anglican Association of Biblical Scholars study series, and it's called Conversations with Scripture, Revelation. There are 13 volumes in the series, and Church Publishing publishes it. Fred Schmidt is the author, and he was the editor of the series, and he is certainly very well trained as a New Testament scholar at Oxford. He has become a spiritual director. He taught spiritual formation at Perkins School of Theology and at Garrett Evangelical Seminary, and now he is a parish priest. So there are several of us who are biblical scholars who are also parish priests, who are members of AABS. It's very interesting. We're becoming more like the Church of England, I think. And here is our schedule. You can see last week was OMG, the Book of Revelation, and then there's Revelation as roadmap, Revelation as myth, Revelation as history, and then the next 4 sessions I don't think I'm going to record because that's going to be more kind of like class discussion, and I'm hoping to get some of you to lead those. That's where he really sort of digs into, these are 5 chapters of Revelation. And that is more of a discussion thing rather than a presentation like this, as far as I can tell. What do you mean by a roadmap? Okay. What Schmidt means by a roadmap reading of the Revelation to John is that people who read Revelation this way believe that if you read the book of Revelation, that this will give you, the readers of Revelation, accurate descriptions of all the things that are going to happen in the future. In other words, you're taking the book of Revelation as prophecy of the future or predictions of the future. Roadmap readings of Revelation tend to be highly literal, and they presuppose that the purpose of the Revelation to John is to inform us in the 20th or 21st century about what is going to happen in the time leading up to the second coming of Christ. And so if you believe that, then that causes you probably to ignore the purpose of the book, which was to strengthen first or second century Christians in Asia Minor. In other words, if you read it historically, as he advises and as I advise, as almost all biblical scholars would advise, when we read it historically, we're trying to read it in its own historical context. And so when you take it out of that context and you make it into a roadmap for the future, as far as we're concerned, then you're doing something very different from what the writer of Revelation had in mind. There are all sorts of different interpretations of the future in the church. One of the things that I didn't have a slide about was in the first decade of the 20th century, there grew up in Protestant Christianity a movement called fundamentalism. And fundamentalism didn't really get going until, there have always been literal readings of the Bible, but it really got going in the first decade of the 20th century, mostly in the United States, although not all, but mostly in the United States. And fundamentalism arose as a reaction against 2 things. One, the theory of natural selection, in other words, evolution, by Charles Darwin, and science in general. And the other is the use of modern ways of studying the Bible, namely historical criticism. And there used to be the terminology of lower criticism and higher criticism of the Bible. And for fundamentalists, lower criticism is okay. And lower criticism meant grammar of, Hebrew and Greek grammar. And especially it meant the textual problems of the Greek New Testament or the Hebrew Bible. In other words, if you could just find out the original text, then that was called, we now call that text criticism or textual criticism. But a long time ago, it was called lower criticism. And so for fundamentalists, lower criticism was just fine, and higher criticism, the stuff that people like me do now, is not just fine. And we were considered heretics. And there were people who were thrown out of churches. One of them, we use a lexicon of Hebrew that's by Brown, Driver, and Briggs. Well, Charles Augustus Briggs was Presbyterian, and he wrote things like, well, the book of Isaiah was not all by Isaiah, because the first 39 chapters, could very well have been written by Isaiah, but unless Isaiah lived to be 150 years old, the book of Isaiah, chapters 40 and following were not really very likely written by the Isaiah of Jerusalem. In other words, he divided up the book of Isaiah into different eras. I mean, the Hebrew is different, and the era that is talked about is different. And so, as well as other things that he talked about that were higher criticism. And for that, the Presbyterians threw him out. They had a heresy trial, and he was convicted. He taught at Union Seminary in New York City. And so he became an Episcopalian and was ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church, etc. So in the Episcopal Church, we have not been usually against higher criticism. But other churches in the United States were, especially Baptists and Presbyterians and certain kinds of Lutherans. Then there was also, I may say, an Anglican bishop in Ireland. His name was James Ussher, Usshur, Ussher. And he calculated the generations and the average length of time it took for there to be a generation in the Hebrew Bible. And he calculated the date of creation as a particular day in October in the year 4004 BC. And so then there got to be this thing, if you didn't believe in evolution, that the earth was only 6,000 years old. And so that is called the young earth idea. And that still raises its ugly head nowadays. Well, geologists know that the earth is, billions of years old now, but they didn't in the 19th century. And so people read the book of Genesis, and they read other parts of the Bible, and then Archbishop Ussher in Ireland calculated the number of generations and the average time of a generation, and he came up with his calculation of October, a certain day in October 4004, and so that allowed you to have a 6-year-old, the earth being, creation having taken place 6,000 years ago, see? And then you got John Nelson Darby, who was a Church of England priest in England, and he came up with the idea of dispensationalism. And dispensationalism goes back to Darby, and he said that there were two basic dispensations. The dispensation of Judaism in the Old Testament was the dispensation of law, and that's how God related to the people of Israel, by giving them the law. And then the next dispensation was through Jesus, and that's the dispensation of grace. So you had two dispensations in Darby. There was also somebody named Miller who believed that the second coming was going to be in 1844. Needless to say, he was wrong. And then there was a dispensationalist preacher in the United States named C.I. Scofield. And he created the first modern study Bible, like the Oxford Annotated Bible, published by Oxford. Before they published something respectable, they published in 1909, and again in 1917, they published the Scofield Reference Bible, which has the King James Version at the top of the page, and then notes about it. In other words, the Old Testament being read in a dispensational way at the bottom of the page. And so that was the first study Bible since the Geneva Bible in the 16th century. And so the notes at the bottom of the page, needless to say, it caught on, and Oxford is still publishing the Scofield Reference Bible. But they created dispensational theology, and I think there's 7 dispensations. And then Scofield brought out a book that explained his theory of dispensations called Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth. And of course, that's what the King James Version says, but it should really be translated Rightly Interpreting the Word of Truth. But Scofield's book is called Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth, and that's the classic thing on dispensationalism. And so he created a church that after his death was named the Scofield Memorial Church. My uncle and aunt in Dallas went to that church. And a pastor of that church after Scofield died was named Louis Sperry Chafer. And Louis Sperry Chafer wrote a systematic theology that was dispensational. And he created Dallas Theological Seminary. And that is the traditional home of dispensational Protestant theology in Dallas. And then there are different ways of looking at it in terms of millennialism. You have in the book of Revelation 1,000 years of peace, and that's called a millennium. And so premillennialists believe that Christ will return before the 1,000 years of peace, and postmillennialists believe that Christ will return after the 1,000 years of peace, and amillennialists believe that the reign of Christ will not be a political outward thing, but it will be manifested in the hearts of faithful believers rather than outward. And then there's pre-tribulation and post-tribulation people. Your Baptist neighbors know about this, okay? And so if you look on page 4 of Schmidt, there is a list of things that are going to happen that dispensational and fundamentalist theology focuses on. And at the top of page 4, you see the list of bullets. The moral decline of civilization. Things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. The rise of the Antichrist. And of course, you got to identify who the Antichrist is, right? And then the reign of terror or the Great Tribulation. Then the battle of Armageddon, that's Har Megiddo, which Har means mountain, and Armageddon, the Antichrist is defeated. The establishment of the 1,000-year reign, the millennium, the final revolt of Satan that is easily countered. Eventually, Satan has to be bound, right? And then the resurrection of the dead. And you have to have the resurrection of the dead in order to have the last judgment, see? And then you have the creation of the new heaven and the new earth. And so this kind of theology, reading the book of Revelation this way, that's how you come up with the emphasis on these 7 or 8 things. And so then in apocalyptic literature, remember that one of the standard features of apocalypses are apocalyptic timetables. Okay, this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen. We call that a timetable. And the events of the book of Revelation are dealt with as an extended apocalyptic timetable. And then what happens is that people who read at Revelation this way identify events happening in the present day or in the perhaps near to come future. They identify them one-to-one with the events of the book of Revelation. In other words, the roadmap readings of Revelation, as Fred Schmidt terms it, they couple a particular reading of the book of Revelation with specific identifications of world events. And sometimes, by the way, in the 16th century, there was some cartoon or woodcut, and there was this fellow in a mitre, dressed as a bishop and all that. And it was the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and apparently Luther identified the Pope as the Antichrist. And so there's also the intense interest in the modern state of Israel. equating Israel in the Bible with the modern state of Israel, which didn't happen until 1948. And then the Battle of Har-Megiddo or Armageddon. And then there are some Christians who are Christian Zionists, that namely, we have to support Israel no matter what, because Israel is talked about in the book of Revelation, and therefore Israel is a good thing. Therefore, the state of Israel is a good thing. And so that is what Christian Zionism is about. And Hal Lindsey is a Christian Zionist. By the way, I have the book over there. It's called The Late Great Planet Earth. And it was a runaway bestseller. And Wikipedia says it was published by Zondervan, and that's the red one there. Zondervan published in 1970, and it went through like 15 printings in a year. Zondervan, of course, is kind of a Dutch name, and of course, one thinks of the Dutch Reformed Church in Michigan. But anyway, The Late Great Planet Earth was picked up by a major secular publisher that publishes a lot of paperback books called Bantam in 1973. And Wikipedia reports that 28 million copies of The Late Great Planet Earth had sold by 1990. And then Hal Lindsey wrote more books after The Late Great Planet Earth. One of them is called Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth. The next one was the 80s Countdown to Armageddon. Then he was very big on rapture theology, truth or consequences. You see, Bantam picked it up and they did more marketing, see. There's a New World Coming, an in-depth analysis of the book of Revelation, 84. The Road to Holocaust, 1989. The Apocalypse Code, like the Da Vinci Code. The Apocalypse Code, 1997. Vanished into Thin Air, the Hope of Every Believer. This is about the rapture. And then Planet Earth, the final chapter, 1999. So let's just say that this was probably commercially rewarding to write books like this, because they sell very well. Books like I write don't sell very well, but books like Hal Lindsey wrote sell very well. By the way, he has a Master of Theology degree from Dallas Theological Seminary, and I give them a lot of credit because they make everybody take Hebrew and Greek. And they also don't try to cram everything into 3 years for an MDiv. They put everything in 4 years, and it's called a Master of Theology degree. So that's 4 years of study rather than 3 years of study like we do. And of course, they're fully accredited. One of the best grammarians and one of the best text critics in the United States is Dan Wallace, who wrote a brilliant grammar of the New Testament and who is a great text critic. And he has recently retired from Dallas Seminary. And then another person, Darrell Bach, has written book after book after book on Luke. And he teaches, I think he's in semi-retirement from Dallas. So they have hired some really excellent biblical scholars. And so Hal Lindsey is now 94 years old. By the way, the book Jesus Against the Rapture by my teacher is a book against the late great planet Earth and rapture theology. But Hal Lindsey's books, as well as by other authors, and you can certainly find them on Amazon, let me assure you, they demonstrate how popular speculation is about the end times based on various readings, literal or otherwise, of the book of Revelation. And then if you're really into the rapture, then you are into a particular reading of 1 Thessalonians 4:13 to 5:3, which it says, the dead in Christ will rise first, then we who are alive, who are left, will join them, and thus we shall join the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. And so that has given rise to rapture theology. They also believe that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians, and they find bits and pieces of that letter and insert that into rapture theology as well. And so, what does all this mean? Well, it means that the roadmap readings of the book of Revelation have caused people in moderate, mainstream, and liberal churches For example, the Episcopal Church, the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and other mainstream churches. We read Revelation in a different way. We use historical criticism. And so we and our church members have often shied away from even talking about the revelation to John. And this frequently means that we usually have not said or taught anything about the book of Revelation at all. And so my doctoral teacher, he lived until 2024, actually. Excuse me, he lived until 2020. He published his book, Jesus Against the Rapture, in 1979, and he was a very notable exception to the liberal aversion to the book of Revelation. And also Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza wrote a commentary on Revelation in a Fortress series focusing on, liberation for the downtrodden and that sort of thing. So all liberal scholars and moderate scholars do not shy away from the book of Revelation, but frankly, most do. And so I think that we're missing something when we do. When we shy away from Revelation, we are missing what a lot of scholars would tell you, and I tell you, is the original intent of the book of Revelation. We need to remember the basic premise of Christian apocalyptic literature, particularly, and that is that there is a war going on at all times between good and evil. There's a struggle between good and evil. You don't just fix things and they stay fixed in our societies. Have you noticed that? And this is not new. It goes back to the second creation story in the book of Genesis, right? God created the world good, but then by giving human beings free choice, Eve chose to listen to the talking snake, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is always a war between good and evil. And apocalyptic literature is one of the ways in which the war between good and evil works out. And so the other thing that happened is the reason that the book of Revelation was probably written in the first century or early second century, but I think could be in the late first century, is to strengthen Christians who are being persecuted or harassed in Asia Minor. Because why should you be strong? Well, because you know that God is going to win the war between good and evil. If you know that God is going to win, then you might be willing to be martyred, right? And so the other thing that the book of Revelation reminds us of is that no nation on planet Earth is without problems. And the struggle between good and evil, call it a war if you wish, but the struggle between good and evil never really goes away in human societies. Surely we know that. Ask anybody who's watched any news channel in the last 5 months. The struggle between good and evil doesn't ever really go away. And so the book of Revelation, I think, is a good reminder of that. We human beings didn't just become evil in the 20th century. There is evil going all the way back, right? And so that's all that I really want to say, and I think that's what he means by Revelation as roadmap, is that when you read the book of Revelation as a prophecy of the future, and you read the apocalyptic stuff as, okay, this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen, and then you start of identifying these things that are going to happen with things that are happening, in the 20th century or in the 21st century, you start making that one-to-one correspondence, which frankly you have no right to make. But when you make that one-to-one correspondence with events of the time that we live in now, then you come up with the idea that Revelation is a prophecy of the future, and that the book of Revelation is a roadmap to the events of the future. And I think that his chapter 1 is a good corrective against that. And other biblical scholars like me would put it in much stronger terms than Fred did. The Antichrist is sort of your super evil figure, and the Antichrist gets raised up, and then people who do the rapture theology and all that, then they identify the guy described in 2 Thessalonians 2, the restrainer, etc. They identify that with the Antichrist of the book of Revelation. So they get going in trying to harmonize 2 Thessalonians 2. And 2 Thessalonians 2, ironically enough, is an apocalyptic timetable, and it tells you here are the things that have to have happened first before the day of the Lord happens. And then in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 to 5:3 is the second coming of Christ and meeting Christ in the air. So you can see that if you it's kind of like puzzle pieces, and you dump out your puzzle pieces on the table, and some people put the puzzle pieces together in, shall we say, different and bizarre ways. And the puzzle pieces don't necessarily fit together the way they do it. If you look at the latter chapters of The Late Great Planet Earth, he says he's not sure about this, but this is what he thinks is going to happen. And he talks about Russia, and he talks about the last great war, and Russia is involved, and et cetera, et cetera. But he couches it very carefully by saying this is how he reads it, and realizing that maybe he ain't necessarily gotten it right, because they're very aware of the shortcomings of roadmap readings in the past. Well, certainly it's not in the sayings material of Jesus, but on the other hand, you do find stuff being attributed to Jesus in Mark 13. The apocalyptic discourse of Mark, which is picked up in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. The Son of Man will come on the clouds, and then so it's not picked up in most of the sayings material in the Gospels. And of course, the sayings material, much of that is about how do we live in the right way in the present life, and how do we live in the right way, giving that God is a God of justice and God is also a God of love, and Jesus heals people because Jesus has compassion and all that. But you can find a judgmental Jesus in Mark 13, in the so-called little apocalypse, which is picked up in Matthew 24, where you have wars and rumors of war, and the Son of Man comes, and you have also the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, where you have, it will be like the sheep on the right and the goats on the left, and the sheep are the people who did things for other people, because if you did it to the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. And then the goats are the people who didn't do it. And the people who did the right things, that are the sheep, they will go into eternal life. And the people who didn't do the right thing, they will go into eternal punishment. So there is judgment and punishment in the Gospels as well, not so much in the sayings material, but in the apocalyptic stuff, not only in Mark, but also in that parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25. You also have it in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man in Luke 16, 19 through 31, where the rich man dies and is in agony in these flames. And then Lazarus dies and is carried by the angels into the bosom of Abraham. Now, your fundamentalist brethren will not say that the story about Lazarus and the rich man in Luke 16, 19 through 31, they will not tell you that that is a parable. They don't think it's a parable. They think that is actual description of the afterlife. But most of us do think it's a parable. So different parts of the Gospels can be read in different ways, and certainly have been. Well, basically, let me climb onto my usual soapbox. My usual soapbox is, well, my God, I'd just like to see fellow Episcopal clergy teaching something about the Bible. Hell, start with Jesus. Start with gentle Jesus, meek and mild if you want, but then teach all the other stuff too. You know, you talk about Jesus, the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount. But talk about the Jesus of Mark. Talk about the conflict between the Jesus and the scribes and the Pharisees. So I really feel that we need to, people like me, parish priests and biblical scholars, and I'm both, we need to make it more and more easy, accessible to have books like this and other books like it so that people can actually pick up the Gospel of Mark, pick up something that somebody writes, like the book that it's at the publisher now, that actually says, here is a reasonable way to read the Gospels, and here is a reasonable way to read the Gospel of Mark. By the way, the first chapter of that book, I think, is called Welcome and something like that, and the next chapter is called Why and How to Read the Gospels. I actually wrote a chapter for regular people, why to read the Gospels and how to read the Gospels. And I do that before I ever start messing with Mark. You know what? If you're in the 8th grade or the 9th grade and you go to Ruston High School or you go to Cedar Creek or you go to Arkansas High School, the teacher in algebra class doesn't just hand you the book and say, okay, this is everything you need to know is in the book. Kindly learn algebra. Nobody does that in public schools, do they? I hope not. You have to teach. You can't just hand the students a book and say, okay, learn this. And yet that's what we tend to do with the Bible. Okay, well, get yourself an RSV, get yourself an NRSV, get yourself a NRSV UE, the update edition, or get the New Jerusalem. Get a Bible you can read, but we don't actually spend time actually teaching it. I think we need to spend time actually teaching it. You don't just hand a student a book of world history and say, well, it's all in the book. The test so that you can graduate high school will be held on May the 4th. It's all in the book. Anything you want to know, if you don't understand anything, ask me. That's not teaching. And people in churches are not a lot different than high school students in terms of their understanding of the Bible, maybe even less.
Yeah, right.
Well, the other thing is that if you read the great book, The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, by Richard Hooker, in the late 16th century, perhaps early 17th century, but the late 16th century, he wrote The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity against a Puritan named Cartwright. And anyway, he talks about there being 3 sources of authority: Scripture, and it's not a 3-legged stool. Scripture is the biggest leg and can carry the most weight. And then there is the use of human reason. And then the third leg, if you can't quite get everything straightened out by using Scripture and interpreting it through reason, then there's also church tradition. So Scripture, reason, and tradition is, I don't like the 3-legged stool, and Hooker did not use that analogy. The legs are not equal. But the idea in fundamentalist, certain strands of Protestantism, you have the 5 solas: solus Christus, sola fide, etc. And one of the other one is sola scriptura. So in the Protestant Reformation, you had this business of you're saved by grace alone through faith alone. You get justified. And in Anglicanism, we agree with justification by faith, but we believe, we read Romans 12 through 15. And in Romans 12 through 15, you actually are supposed to do something about your faith. And the reason you do something about your faith and do good works is because the Holy Spirit urges you to do these good works. That's also the message of the book of James. But Paul never says that you're not supposed to do good works. He just doesn't say that you are somehow saved by doing good works. By the way, neither did Judaism. So if you look at Scripture in a kind of sola scriptura way, and you don't somehow couple that with the authority of the church, to interpret Scripture, and you don't balance your teaching and reading of Scripture with other parts of Christian worship like liturgy, then you end up being a little bit very much one-sided. And in Anglicanism, we like to talk about the balance between word and sacrament. Not just the word alone, but word and sacrament. So in Anglicanism, at our best, we tend to believe that it's appropriate to have a kind of a corrective to people looking at Scripture in not very good ways. But unfortunately, we convey that to our clergy when they go to seminary. And unfortunately, it is not trickling down to our laity. That's why I do all this stuff. You realize we now have 100 videos. This video will be the 101st video on our YouTube channel. So it's not perfect by any means, but it's a step in the right direction. But for example, given my interest in Mark, I actually went over to St. Paul's in Shreveport on 3 Wednesday nights and taught through Mark at St. Paul's in Shreveport, in the middle of what used to be a cotton field. And then on 5 Wednesdays in Lent, I went over to Grace and taught through the Gospel of Mark in 5 sessions over at Grace in Monroe. So that's not perfect. I'm not perfect, but we have to start somewhere. And I think the local parish priest should be able to do that. And we need to, scholars and writers, we need to try to make it easy for the parish clergy to do it.